Karen thought she could bully my disabled sister over a fence, but she didn't know Margaret was a Supreme Court judge ready to fight B. Before watching full video, comment below from which country you are watching. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood called Oakwood, where the HOA runs everything. One morning I hear a loud crash that shakes me awake. I run outside, my heart pounding, and see my 75-year-old elder sister, Margaret Reynolds, lying on the ground under her balcony. Blood drips from her temple, staining the grass. Her wheelchair is next to her, tipped over and broken, its wheels bent. She looks so small and hurt, and I feel sick seeing her like that. Up on the balcony stands Laura Bennett, the HOA president. She's holding the railing, her face pretending to be shocked. "The railing just collapsed," she shouts, her voice loud but fake. Her hands grip a loose piece of the balcony, and something about her looks wrong. Then Emily Carter, our neighbor across the street, screams, "That's not true. I saw you push her." Emily's pointing at Laura, her eyes wide with anger. I drop to my knees beside Margaret, checking if she's alive. She's breathing but barely, and I can't stop shaking. Ambulance sirens start howling closer, cutting through the quiet morning. Laura keeps talking, saying it was an accident, but I don't trust her. She doesn't know who she's hurt. Margaret isn't just my disabled sister who's fought to live every day since her accident left her in a wheelchair. She's Justice Margaret Reynolds, a retired Supreme Court judge who spent 30 years making sure people like Laura faced the law. I look up at Laura, still acting innocent, and feel anger growing inside me. She thinks she's won, but she has no idea who she's really up against. This is bigger than a broken railing. My sister Margaret's house has a special wooden fence she carved by hand years ago, before she lost the use of her legs. It surrounds her rose garden, full of bright, beautiful flowers she's grown for decades. Now at 75 she's in a wheelchair, and that garden is the one thing she can still take care of. She rolls out there every day tending the roses with shaky hands. It's not just a fence to her, it's a piece of who she used to be, strong and proud. Then Laura Bennett, the tough HOA president, came along. She showed up one day looking perfect in her fancy clothes and called the fence an eyesore. She handed Margaret a citation, a piece of paper saying the fence broke HOA rules. Laura's voice was loud and mean, like she didn't care Margaret couldn't stand up to argue. But Margaret stayed calm, sitting straight in her wheelchair. She told Laura her house was built 25 years before the HOA even started. She pulled out old legal papers from a box beside her, one she wrote herself when she was a Supreme Court judge. Her voice was quiet but firm as she showed Laura the proof that her fence didn't have to follow their rules. Laura didn't like that at all. Her face got tight and her eyes turned cold. She didn't expect a disabled woman to fight back. "We'll deal with this," she snapped, her words sharp like a slap. Then she turned and stormed off, her shoes clicking hard on the path. I watched her go, feeling mad for Margaret. Laura thought she could bully my sister because of her wheelchair, but she didn't know Margaret's strength came from years of justice, not her legs. After Laura lost the first fight about the fence, she didn't give up. She and her HOA friends started bothering Margaret every single day. They'd show up with cameras, snapping pictures of her hand-carved fence like it was a crime scene. They sent fake complaints to the HOA, saying the fence made the neighborhood look bad or hurt property values. At night, I'd find scary notes slipped under Margaret's door, things like, "Get rid of it or else," written in angry handwriting. It was hard for Margaret to stop them. Her wheelchair doesn't move fast, and by the time she rolled to the door or window they were gone. I'd see her sitting there helpless and it made me so mad. She didn't deserve this. But Margaret didn't break. She's 75 and disabled, but she's tough from her 30 years as a Supreme Court judge. She once faced down dangerous criminals in court without blinking, and this was no different. One day when I was upset about another note, she looked at me with her steady eyes. "Justice wins with facts, not fear," she said. Her voice was calm, even though her hands shook a little in her lap. She'd learned long ago how to stay strong, and Laura's tricks weren't going to scare her. I could see the old judge in her still, the one who never let bullies win. Things got worse one afternoon. I was inside when I heard Margaret call out weakly. I ran to the garden and saw Laura standing there, right in the middle of Margaret's roses. She trespassed, her fancy shoes smashing the flowers Margaret loved so much. Petals were crushed under her feet, and she held a little shovel, pretending to check the soil. "Just making sure it's safe," she said with a fake smile, but her eyes were mean. Margaret rolled her wheelchair closer, her face tight with anger. "Get off my property," she said, her voice low but sharp. Laura just laughed and stepped on another rose before leaving. I wanted to yell, but Margaret stopped me. She couldn't chase Laura herself, and that hurt her more than the ruined flowers. That night Margaret made a move. She picked up her phone with those shaky hands and called Detective Thomas Hayes. He's an old friend who used to work for her as a clerk when she was a judge. Now he's a cop with the county. "Thomas," she said, "I need you to look into Laura Bennett. She's up to something." Her voice was quiet but sure, like she was back in a courtroom. She told him about the harassment, the notes, and now the garden. Thomas promised to dig into it. I could tell Margaret wasn't just mad, she was building a plan. Laura thought she was weak because of the wheelchair, but Margaret was already fighting back the way she always did, with justice. Laura wasn't done making trouble for Margaret. She decided to use her HOA power to hit harder. One day she set up an emergency meeting with the HOA board. They voted to fine Margaret $150 every day until her fence was gone. Laura picked the time on purpose, when Margaret was at the doctor getting her legs checked. Margaret's wheelchair makes those trips slow and tough, and Laura knew she couldn't be there to fight back. When we got home, I saw a notice taped to the door, bold letters saying Margaret owed money starting right away. I was furious, but Margaret just rolled over, grabbed the paper and read it quietly. Then she smiled a little. "They made a mistake," she said. "HOA rules say they have to give 14 days warning. This won't stand." Even in her wheelchair, she was still the judge who spotted every trick. A few days later, Laura sent a building inspector to Margaret's house. He showed up with a clipboard, poking around the fence in the yard looking for something to blame. Laura stood nearby, watching with a smug look, thinking she'd win. Margaret rolled out to meet him, asking questions in her calm voice. The inspector seemed nervous and finally left, saying he found nothing wrong. Laura's face tightened, but she didn't say anything. That night, Margaret decided to fight smarter. She took out tiny cameras she'd ordered, small enough to hide with her shaky hands from her wheelchair. I helped her set them up around the house, taping them to the fence and windows. "They won't expect this," she said, her eyes sharp. Things turned darker soon after. One evening I caught Laura's husband, David Bennett, outside with a measuring tape. He was checking Margaret's balcony rails, acting like he was just looking around. I told Margaret and she nodded, not surprised. Later that night, a loud crash woke us up. A brick had smashed through her front window, glass all over the floor. I found a note tied to it, "Tear it down or pay." My heart raced. I wanted to run out and catch them, but Margaret couldn't move fast in her wheelchair. She just sat there staring at the mess, her face hard. "They think I'm helpless," she said quietly. "They're wrong." She wasn't scared, not even a little. I could see the judge in her, the one who'd faced worse than bricks and notes. Laura and David thought her disability made her weak, but Margaret was already planning her next move, ready to turn their own game against them. One evening Margaret called me into her study. Her wheelchair was pulled tight to her old wooden desk, papers spread out in front of her. She looked tired but focused, her hands trembling as she pointed to a stack of documents. "Laura's not just after my fence," she said, her voice low but strong. "It's bigger than that." She told me she'd been digging into things even with all the harassment. She found out Laura's brother, Richard Evans, owns a company that buys houses cheap from old people in the neighborhood. "They've been in trouble with the HOA first," she said. "Then they sell fast, way below what the houses are worth." She showed me property records she'd collected, names, dates, prices, all written in her careful handwriting from her judge days. I could see the worry in her eyes, not just for herself but for everyone Laura was hurting. Margaret had been busy. She rolled her wheelchair to a shelf and pulled down a blue folder, thick with papers. "This is my case," she said, opening it. Inside were pictures of Laura's people sneaking around, stories from neighbors about threats, and even HOA money records she'd gotten somehow. "They're stealing from the HOA too," she explained, "taking dues and using them for themselves." Her hands shook as she flipped through it, but her mind was sharp, piecing it all together. She'd spent 30 years as a Supreme Court judge, and now she was building a case again, right from her wheelchair. "Laura thinks I'm too weak to fight," she said. "But I'm going to stop her game." The next day Laura came back with her biggest move yet. She banged on Margaret's door, holding a new notice. "Take the fence down by tomorrow," she demanded, "or you'll pay huge fines, thousands." Her voice was loud and mean, like she was sure she'd won. Margaret sat in her wheelchair looking up at her and didn't flinch. Laura smirked and left, thinking Margaret couldn't do anything. But that night I saw Margaret pick up her phone. She rolled to a quiet corner, her shaky fingers dialing a number. "It's Margaret," she whispered. "It's ready." I realized she was talking to her old judge friends from the courthouse, people she'd worked with for years. Her voice was soft but sure, like she'd already seen the end of this fight. Laura thought she could scare a disabled old woman into giving up, but Margaret wasn't just waiting. She'd been preparing, gathering every fact she needed. Her wheelchair didn't stop her, it made her even more determined to bring justice. It was a sunny morning and I was outside helping Margaret with her roses. She loves those flowers, they're her pride even at 75. She can't walk anymore, so she rolled her wheelchair up a ramp we'd built to her balcony. Up there, she waters her hanging plants, reaching out carefully from her seat. I was down below, handing her a watering can when Laura stormed in. She marched right onto the balcony, her face red and angry, holding papers in her hand. "Sign this," she yelled at Margaret. "It says you'll tear down that fence now." Her voice was loud, mean, like she was talking to a child. Margaret looked at her, calm as always, and said, "No. It's my fence, my right." Laura's eyes narrowed. She stepped closer, and before I could climb up to stop her, she pushed Margaret, hard. Margaret's wheelchair tipped over the edge and she fell with it. I heard the crash, metal and wood hitting the ground, and my heart stopped. I ran to her. Margaret was crumpled on the grass, her wheelchair smashed beside her, roses crushed under it. Blood trickled from her head. Above, Laura screamed, "It was an accident. The railing broke." She sounded scared, but her hands held a loose rail, and her face didn't match her words. I looked up, furious, and remembered the cameras Margaret had hidden. They'd caught everything. The night before, I'd seen flickers of light outside, Laura and her husband David sneaking around, loosening the balcony rails with tools. Now the video would show Laura pushing Margaret on purpose. She thought no one would know. The ambulance came fast, sirens blaring. Paramedics lifted Margaret onto a stretcher, her small body limp. I held her hand, tears in my eyes. She was hurt bad. Her arm was broken, her ribs bruised, and she had a concussion. But she was alive, breathing shallowly. As they wheeled her into the ambulance, her eyes opened a little. She grabbed my arm with her good hand, weak but firm, and whispered, "Get my blue folder. It's time." Her voice was faint, but I knew what she meant. That folder in her study held all her proof, pictures, notes, everything to take Laura down. Even lying there, broken and in pain, Margaret wasn't giving up. Laura thought pushing a disabled woman off a balcony would end this, but she didn't know my sister. Margaret had fought bigger battles from a courtroom, and now, from a stretcher, she was ready to fight again. After Margaret was taken to the hospital, I grabbed her blue folder and called Detective Thomas Hayes. He's her old friend from when he worked for her as a clerk, now a tough cop. He got there fast, pulling up in his car while I waited outside Margaret's room. I handed him the folder and told him about the cameras. He watched the video on a little screen, clear as day. It showed Laura and David sneaking around the night before, loosening the balcony rails, and then Laura pushing Margaret off, wheelchair and all. Thomas's face got hard. He didn't say much, just nodded and walked into the hospital waiting room where Laura was sitting. She was still holding her fancy purse, acting worried, telling people it was an accident. Thomas didn't buy it. "Laura Bennett," he said, loud and official, "you're under arrest for assault, attempted murder, and tampering." Her mouth dropped open, her purse slipping to the floor. She didn't expect this. Then came the big moment. Laura started yelling, "Do you know who I am? I run the HOA." Thomas smiled a little, calm and steady. "And do you know who Margaret Reynolds is?" he asked. Laura blinked, confused. "She's Justice Reynolds," he said. "A Supreme Court judge for 30 years. She wrote the big laws about homes and rights that every lawyer knows." He started quoting one of her old cases, something about protecting people from unfair rules. Laura's face went white as a sheet. She'd thought Margaret was just a weak, disabled old lady, but she'd attacked a legend who'd shaped the law. Thomas kept talking, telling her how Margaret mentored judges and cops like him. Laura couldn't say a word, she was caught. The police didn't stop there. With Margaret's folder and the video, they dug into Laura's whole scheme. They searched her house, the HOA office, everything. It turned out Laura's HOA was rotten. They'd stolen money, hundreds of thousands, from the dues people paid. Fake bills for repairs that never happened, all going to Laura's family. Worse, they'd been pushing old people in the neighborhood to sell their houses cheap. Threats, fake fines, broken windows, just like with Margaret. The police found papers linking it all to Laura's brother, Richard Evans, and his company. He'd buy the houses for almost nothing after the HOA scared people out. Laura thought she could get away with it, but Margaret's evidence broke it wide open. Even from her hospital bed, my sister made sure justice won, just like she always had.